Good evening, sir, and good evening to all the participants present in this session. This is Anika Sharma. I am moderator for today's session, and I am recently working as an external manager with the Amicus Curie. And I welcome you all on behalf of the entire Amicus Curie family to this national webinar on cross-border transactions. Today we have with us Sir Rohan Batra, who is Advocates on Record, Supreme Court of India, and the co-founder of R&R Law Chambers. He began his career with ELP in the field of tax litigation. He was representing clients before various tax authorities, tribunals, and high courts. He joined Amarchand Mangaldas, which we now recognize as Shardul Amarchand Mangaldas, in the disputes practice. At SAM, he was part of several corporate commercial litigations and arbitrations. In 2019, he moved out of SAME as principal associate to co-found R&R Law Chambers. R&R Law Chambers is headquartered in Delhi with an associate office at Bombay. Now we call it Mumbai. The Chambers provides legal representation in complex and high-value commercial disputes before various courts and tribunals in India, with a specialized focus on in-house advocacy. Transactional and corporate advisory work is handled through Associate Office at Mumbai. This is what, in limited time, I can introduce Rohan Batra sir to you. I would like sir now to take over. Thank you very much. Sorry, sir, you're not audible. So unmute your mic. You're still not audible. Sorry, everyone. We'll be starting shortly. There's some network issues. Still not audible. So, have you connected your audio to the internet?
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes, so it's very clear.
Okay, sorry for the technical glitches at my end. Thank you for this warm welcome, Anika, and thank you, Amicus Curiae, for giving this opportunity to share some of my thoughts on this gripping subject that we all hear and see about and talk about at a work level. So, before we begin, can anyone just give me a rough understanding of what is the meaning of a cross border transaction? Just so that we're on the same page. Anika, Tanushri, would you guys want to share your preliminary thoughts on it?
Yes, so what stand cross-border transactions between two countries, or it may be between diplomats or between two governments, or any diplomatic transaction that has been happening between them. What I understand about cross.
Absolutely. So let's take a real life example, like a phone. Let's say, Anika, you own a lovely business of manufacturing fantastic phones in China, and you've been selling your products to your Indian entity. When I say Indian entity, it means the entity which is your subsidiary in India. And you sell this product to that entity in India. And then from there, that Indian entity sells this product out in the open market. And that's how I got my phone. So, in this transaction, what we normally hear about is that at the international level or at the level of China, this phone is, let's say, sold to the Indian entity for 100 rupees. And then in Indian market, after factoring in the import duty, etc., this phone is then sold at about 150. Of course, factoring in the profit margin of the Indian entity. What happens in certain cases is that because of the tax regimes which are prevalent in two different jurisdictions, such as in this case, China and India, because of the difference in the tax rates which are applicable, companies try and optimize the transaction price, or let's say the price of the product, in such a way that they get the maximum profit out of a transaction. And that can only happen when they're in a position to minimize the amount of tax or the tax incidence which happens on this transaction. So let's say in the example that I just mentioned, instead of selling that phone at 100 rupees to the Indian entity, which then further sells it at 150 rupees, your company, Anika, sells it at 140 rupees. And then the Indian company sells it further for 150. What has happened in this transaction? The large chunk of the profit margin, which was say 50 bucks, out of that 50 bucks, 40 bucks in a way is going out of India to the entity in China. Now, the reason for that could be that the tax rates in China are much lower. That may not be the case here, but hypothetically speaking, the tax rates in China would be much lower, which is why they want to transfer the bulk of the profit to China and reduce the incidence of tax. So, what ultimately gets taxed in India is only $10. So, to cater to these practices, or how we colloquially call it, the shrewd practices of a businessman, and so that the tax regimes in question don't lose out on their fair share of revenue which they get by imposing a tax, they've come up with this concept of transfer pricing. Transfer pricing, by its very nature, means the price at which something gets transferred. And this is set in the context of an international transaction. Now, this was just to give you guys a flavor of how a cross border transaction will work. There could be various types of such cross border transactions, and we took just one example out of them. How does the Indian tax regime or the Income Tax Act deal with such a scenario of transfer pricing? So, amongst the various provisions of the Income Tax Act, there is one section, one chapter, which is dedicated to transfer pricing. And that is chapter 10 of the Income Tax Act. That chapter 10 is housed under the heading Special Provisions Relating to Avoiding of Tax. In that, there are sections right from 92 to 92F, which explain this concept of transfer pricing and how it actually works. My idea today, my objective would be to give you a brief flavor of the concepts which underline these sections. Why do we have these provisions? How do they work? And what are the things to be kept in mind? And post that, if any of you have any questions, I'll try to the best of my ability to answer them. As far as the provisions are concerned, or the statutory framework, we can consider it at two levels. One, at the level of the Act itself and the sections that we mentioned. And the second is the rules, notifications, and all the circulars which are issued from time to time on this very topic. Today, we'll just confine ourselves to a few of those provisions under the Income Tax Act. Now, as I mentioned earlier, a cross-border transaction is typically an international transaction. Something is happening across the borders of two different regimes, two or more for that matter. That is why the concept of transfer pricing hinges around an international transaction. And that is the first and the foremost criteria for these transfer pricing provisions to even come into play. Some of you might know that there is now a concept of specified domestic transactions as well, which is covered by that very chapter. We'll not get into it. Those are select transactions which are considered to be international in some sense, and that is why transfer pricing comes in. But let's stick to the plain vanilla or the simple classical concept of an international transaction that we discussed in the opening. The main provision is, of course, section 92 here, which simply says that, I'll just read it out for everyone's benefit. Any income arising from an international transaction shall be computed having regard to the arm's length price. Now, look very carefully at how this section has been worded. And this is actually the main provision based on which all the other provisions flow. What the provision simply says is that if there's an income, which is point number one, which arises from an international transaction, the price or the income has to be computed based on an arm's length. principle. Now, these three concepts is what underlines or finds the edifice of this entire chapter. And I'll deal with these three concepts alone today. The first is the income. Now, income, as it is defined in the Income Tax Act, is what is covered under Section 9. And as far as Section 9 is concerned, it further relates to the definition of income, which comes under Section 2, subsection 24, which is your basically the profit and the gain that you make, or the dividends that you get, or the host of different kinds of income that this definitional clause provides. It includes your value of perquisites, etc. From the perspective of our topic today, it essentially means the profit that one derives from a transaction. It could also mean the value of certain rights, which can be measured in terms of money, which you obtain from a transaction or in lieu of a transaction. So for simplistic understanding, it's simply to keep in mind, this is a profit element that we're talking about. Now comes the second aspect, international transactions. And as we spoke about Anika's company, which is doing fantastically well in China as we speak, and if that company is undertaking international transactions with an Indian entity across borders, what do we call those two Indian entities? And why should they be covered by transfer pricing? Someone might ask in this group, well, what if the company in China sells it to an independent company? Do transfer pricing provisions still apply? Valid question. And the answer is no, they shouldn't. There has to be a nexus between these two entities. I'll come to that, what that nexus is, which gives the transfer pricing authorities or the income tax a feeling that the price at which they might be undertaking a transaction is not a fair price. It might either be depressed or might be inflated, depending on some advantage is to be gained, or there is some advantage in avoiding a tax, or tax implication is there. So if it's between two random parties or two third parties, unrelated parties, then these provisions will not come into play. The provisions come into play when there's a nexus. And the Act, under Section 92B, while it explains what that nexus is, under 92A, it defines the character of these two entities and calls them associate enterprises. Section 92A says that where there's a transaction taking place between two or more associated enterprises, then this is a transaction on which arm's length principle can come into picture. Rather, it says it shall come into the picture. Now, what are these associate enterprises? As we use the word nexus quite loosely, the Act uses the word associated enterprises. Now, associated enterprise means that there has to be some association between the two. This Act defines the association into broadly two forms. It's either having control over that company by having some shareholding, or it has control over the management of that company. Now, let's say in that first example, the China company, if that has control over either the shareholding or the management, which we call the board of directors of the Indian company, then someone can easily say that this is an associated enterprise. And both of them are, in that sense, associated enterprises of each other. The Act also provides for various subforms of how to arrive at this control and management. And there are about 8 or 9 types in which the Act defines it. Let me give you a few examples. The first is shareholding. If the Chinese company in this case holds not less than 26% of the share capital of the Indian company and has voting rights, and that voting power gives that Chinese company the ability to control the management of that company or the capital infusion for that company, then someone can say it's an associated enterprise. Let me give you another example. If, let's say, the entity which is selling in India is solely dependent on the IPR or the brand, the license which the Chinese company gives, and without which it actually cannot sell that phone for that matter, without using that brand name, then also the Act construes it to be an associated enterprises. Section 92A gives a fairly detailed list of such instances. And the law seems to be that you not only have to satisfy that there is an association between you and the entity, either in the form of 26% or more of shareholding, or the IPR instance we just discussed, or there could be also a case of someone providing loan up to 50% of the book value of their company, and so on and so forth. Not only these conditions have to be complied with, but the first condition also that all of this gives one entity the ability to control the management or the capital of that entity is also satisfied. So both have to be satisfied in that sense for it to become an associated enterprise. Now let's say we've established this, then it's quite clear that the Chinese parent company owns about 50% or more of the Indian company. It's a clear case of the Indian company and the Chinese company being associated enterprises of each other. Now that's when the problem starts to arise from a taxation perspective. That's when your revenue authorities, your Central Board of Direct Taxes, they say that, look, because you have a parent-subsidiary relationship, God knows how you want to price your transaction. There are no market forces at play. There is no bargaining position. Both of you internally can decide to price it any which way and avoid the incidence of tax. And we can't let that happen. So what these guys say, the legislature in this case, that look, you do your transaction, we don't have a problem. But you do it on the basis of an arm's length price. And this takes us to the third concept. Why an arm's length price? So an arm's length price is also defined under section 92F. To say a price, let me read it out. Actually, the definition is quite important. It means a price which is applied or proposed to be applied in a transaction between persons other than associated enterprises in uncontrolled conditions. In other words, if there was a transaction between two unrelated entities, where of course market forces of supply, demand, currency fluctuations, and many others would have come into play, the price would have been determined keeping into account or factoring those uncontrolled conditions. And that is, by the way, the price which is to be used as a benchmark to check whether the price fixed between those two associated enterprises is actually a genuine price or not. If it is way off the mark, if it is departing from the arm's length price to a prescribed percentage, then the income tax authorities will say, look, this is not a genuine price and we need to reassess your income. So by bringing in the concept of an arm's length price, what the legislature is essentially trying to do is that you do your transaction between your parent company or other forms of associated enterprise, we have no problem. but you have to keep a genuine price on this transaction. If you keep some deflated price or some inflated price, you over invoice, under invoice for whatever reason, with the ultimate object of avoiding tax, then we will have to test it on the basis of arm's length principle. Now, how do you assess this arm's length price? That is actually the next question. Now, the Act itself under Section 92C provides for 5 methods for determining this arm's length price. Now, interestingly, the objective of course, all these 5 prices of formula is to arrive at a genuine arm's length price, which takes place in an uncontrolled environment where market forces of demand and supply come in. That's the ultimate object. The Act does not give any priority to any method. It just says that you keep in mind the parties involved, the nature of transaction, and see which out of these 5 methods or any other method that we might prescribe tomorrow, which is the most appropriate one. And largely, the first 3 methods, which I'm just going to read out, are the ones which are in practice or most commonly resorted to. Number 1 is the comparable uncontrolled price method. Now you will get a sense of what this price method is from the way that the statute itself describes it. It first says a comparable, then it says uncontrolled, and thirdly it says price method. Now, what does this method actually mean? It basically says that if this phone that we spoke about is being sold from China to India at the 140 price that we just discussed, how do we get to know whether this price of 140 is a genuine arm's length price or not? The simplest way is to actually see if there's any other Chinese exporter who is doing a comparable transaction with an unrelated entity in India. If all the comparable factors, let's say such as price, discount, volume, quantity, quality, all these factors are comparable, then let's look at that price to see whether this price is genuine or not. So if there's a similar price of, let's say, 138 rupees for a similar kind of a product, then the tax authorities might accept your transfer pricing. And it is the very nature of this method, or the very nature of the operation of this method comes into being when you have an external transaction like this to compare. Now, this method is not applicable universally, where there is no such external or third-party reference. And 2, even if it is not comparable to a very high degree, because the Act says it has to be a like-to-like comparison. That is why there are other methods. And the second method is actually used when the comparable uncontrolled price method is not available. The second method is actually called the resale price method. Now, what does this method signify? What it does is it follows a reverse engineering approach. It tries to figure out the correct price from the resale price. Now, the resale price in this is the price at which the Indian entity sells this product to someone in the market. And in that product, you take the resale price which the Indian entity offers to the person outside, which was 150 in this case. The idea is to go back, reverse engineer, and find out what should have been the right price at which the Indian entity should have purchased it from the Chinese entity. So what it does is, after taking your price of 150, it tries to assess from the market that what is the regular margin of profit that the Indian entity would have made, or an entity situated in the same position as the Indian entity would have made in the market by selling a similar product. They calculate that margin, or the gross margin, profit margin, and then they subtract it from this price of 150 to get that price, which should have been the price that the Chinese company should have charged. For example, if after doing this assessment, it comes out that the profit margin should have been 25 rupees. Whereas in this case, the profit margin being retained by the Indian entity was only 10 rupees. Then in that case, the Indian authorities, tax authorities will say, look, you have over invoiced or deflate or inflated the price so as to reduce the profit margin, which in normal circumstances, in uncontrolled circumstances, would have been 125. So now you have to pay tax on the deficit amount. So that is the idea of this resale price method. It follows this reverse engineering approach. Now, there are also cases where this resale price may not be available. In those cases, they try to follow the third method, where they actually do an extrapolation from the cost incurred for manufacturing it, or manufacturing that product, or the cost incurred to provide a certain service. And that is why it's called a cost plus method. Now, the idea of a cost plus method is to first assess the cost involved in providing a service or selling a good, and then add the profit margin on top of it to come at the correct price, or the arm's length price. So in this case, the cost of manufacturing and selling that phone would be assessed at the Chinese entity level to see at what price did they, or at what cost did they actually make this phone. And then on top of that, they will assess what should have been the regular profit margin, which should be levied on top of it. And that's how they will come to the price at which the Chinese company would have sold it to the Indian entity. So these are simply different methods, or rather different permutation and combination, to arrive at that same figure, the price at which the transfer took place, and whether that price or the transfer price is an arm's length price. There are other methods which are not usually resorted to, such as a profit split method or a transactional net margin method. So in profit split method, there is no transaction-wise analysis which is taking place, like the way we are discussing. We are looking at one transaction, either comparing it to the outside, or reverse engineering it, or extrapolating it to come to a situation, or a situation of the correct transfer price. There are situations in which the transactions of the two parties are so interlinked that it doesn't make sense to do a transactional analysis. And what you do is you check the profits made by both these entities, keeping in mind how much both these entities is going to ask, or rather spend their resources on, to generate that kind of a profit. And that is why these methods are there. So ultimately, these methods, there is no favorite method. These are all depending on the situation or the nature of the transaction or the parties, that these methods are chosen by the parties themselves, which they consider to be the most appropriate for arriving at the transfer price. Now, this brings us to the last topic of transfer pricing, which is what all transactions are covered. We just took one example, right, of a phone. What about someone selling meat across the country or across borders, or someone giving me a license to print books under that brand name, or somebody selling me machinery. So, a thumb rule to remember what all transactions might get covered is that it practically covers everything from tangibles to intangibles, and even transactions where there is exchange of money, like a lending and borrowing, or for that matter, any other transaction which we feel can happen between two associated enterprises and results in a benefit or a service or facility provided to the other entity. So either you fall under a category of a tangible item or a tangible goods, or an intangible goods or services, or lending, borrowing money, or where there's even a benefit being passed on. All those transactions get covered. And perhaps what I should have clarified in the beginning is that these associated enterprises have to be either one or both of them non-residents, which is basically to say that we are not talking about domestic transactions or domestic parties. We are talking about a transaction where there is at least one of them is non-resident, if not both of them. And non-resident, as you all know, has a specific meaning under the Income Tax Act. It is when you don't qualify the criteria of either being an ordinary resident or a resident but not ordinary resident. In all of those cases, this provision doesn't apply. It's only when you're technically a non-resident, someone who's outside India for a certain amount of time, as defined in the Act, that's when this transaction or these provisions come into play for transactions between two associated enterprises. Now, how does the income tax keep a track on you? And with this, I think I will leave the floor open to any questions any one of you might have. How does the income tax authority get to know what method you're using? What is the right method? Are you doing it correctly as per the provisions or not? So it imposes on the parties a certain level of compliance. The first and rather the most important compliance is getting a report from an auditor or an accountant on the nature of this transaction. So under section 92E, before that company even files the income tax returns, it has to get a report from the accountant which certifies that this is a transfer pricing transaction. This is the price we've taken, this is the methodology we followed, and this is correct in terms of the Act. Apart from that, 92D talks about certain documents which are to be maintained by both the companies. Now, those documents, essentially, some of them are mandatory, some of them are advisory nature. The idea behind those documents is simply to substantiate the transfer pricing calculation. So if tomorrow the income tax authorities want to reopen your assessment or they want to check your price, you must have some backup which shows that this is how I arrived at the transfer price and this is why it's correct. It could be in the form of a market study or some calculation that you had done, a cost breakup calculation. All those are different types of data points that the companies have to maintain. This ensures, and once these documents or data points are maintained and shared with the authorities by the prescribed dates, it ensures that they have visibility of over how we are doing it, of how the transfer pricing provisions are being complied with. Once that is clear, then you go home, you enjoy the profits that the company makes. There are other concepts which have come, like advanced transfer pricing agreements. Those are, of course, in cases where a multinational company wants to assess beforehand what is the transfer pricing implication. It can even enter into contract with the Indian government to first determine the price for the transfer pricing transaction. And once that price is determined, parties are supposed to follow it. So in a way, that ensures that tomorrow this price is not opened up. And for all of you aspiring to be tax practitioners tomorrow, there's one important thing to be kept in mind, that if for some reason there's a problem in the disclosures or the filings, or turns out that the transfer pricing formula is not correct, the assessing officer under 92C can call and issue a show cause notice to you to test your calculation of transfer pricing. And there are many show cause notices which are issued under 92C from time to time, where parties are called upon to explain how have you done this transfer pricing. The Act has also prescribed or designated a transfer pricing officer to whom a reference can also be made by the assessing officer to get clarity on what should the transfer pricing be a transaction. Just very quickly to cover it, a transfer pricing officer could be your assistant commissioner, joint commissioner, or deputy commissioner income tax. Those are people with high credentials and an extensive amount of experience, which helps them decide how to do this calculation. In either of these events, if there is a reference or there is not a reference, the assessing officer will ultimately take a call whether the transfer pricing adopted is correct or not. If it is not, then not only will it reopen that transaction, it can also reopen the entire income which that business entity is supposed to take and put the correct tax figure on it, which might result in an enhanced liability to pay. So next time you pick up a phone like this from the market, you'll get to know that a lot goes behind it for the company who makes it. And if there are any questions now, I'm happy to answer them to the best of my ability.
So there are some questions in the chat box. I'll read them out. The first is how the transactions that are happening are fully transparent to each of the parties or not. How is that known? One second.
Okay, so that's a valid question, first of all. So the answer is simple. This kind of transaction is taking place, as we said in the beginning, between two known parties. It is a transaction between two associated enterprises. It is not a transaction between two strangers, so to speak, where a concept of someone cheating the other or someone not disclosing the correct cost, etc., comes into being. So what happens in these associated enterprises is there is a certain degree of flexibility which is given to them to decide on the price, de-horse what is happening in the market. So even if the market says you sell the phone for 100, they can internally decide, I will only bill you 80 rupees. Both parties are aware that we are charging 80 rupees. But they can do so because both parties are in a way known to each other. So once there is this association, that's when the transfer pricing provision comes in to say, look, you explain why there is a gap between 80 and 100. And if that gap is justifiable, fair enough. But if not, if there's a certain degree of variation beyond which it should not have happened, which is I think 1% for this year now, if there's a difference in the transaction price and the arm's length price to a degree of 1%, then in those cases, those assessments are reopened. The point being the parties know each other, they fix the price, and there's no concept of cheating inter se. The cheating actually is from the perspective of them versus the tax authorities. So I hope I was able to answer that question.
The next question is, the price is fixed by the parental company. The price of one and the subsidiary company have any chance to transfer price?
So if I understand the question correctly, we are trying to say if the price is fixed by the parental company price and the subsidiary company have any chance to transfer price. Yes, if the subsidiary company is undertaking another cross-border transaction from country B to country C to another associated entity, then yes. But if the subsidiary company is simply selling it out in the open market, then the transfer pricing will happen only between the parent company and the subsidiary company.
Oh, thank you very much. So, one another question: will consumers be charged more when banks recover the losses from lower cross-border payments fees?
Okay, so this is a bit of a trick question. Will consumers be charged more? Okay, I understand. So in a case like this, let's say the revenue authorities figure out that the transaction was being depressed or being or it was taking place at a low price than before, then what happens? You're right, the revenue authorities figure it out and say, look, you need to increase the price and therefore you have to pay more tax. In those cases, if let's say the phone in this case has already been sold to the end consumer, then the revenue authorities has no concern with that end consumer because that consumer has paid the price which it was asked to pay. So that bargain is completely different. What the tax authorities will look at is the bargain between these two entities, associated enterprises, and even if it results in a higher payment of tax, that is not going to affect the price which was charged to the end consumer. I hope that was the question and I was able to answer it.
So, any more questions? So, you can write them in the chat box. We'll wait for 2 minutes, and if there will be no question, then we'll wrap up the session.
Anika, I think this happens only in two situations. Either I've done a very good job that everyone's understood, or I've done such a horrible job that people have so many questions and they're sort of afraid to ask and embarrass me.
So, people are replying that this was a great session by Sir. There's a review in the chat box.
No, I think Jasleen is being very kind here. But guys, if you have any questions, feel free to ask me. We still have about, I think, 2 or 3 minutes to go. Okay, what I can do is, I think this was just gyan, or I was just vomiting out some provisions and giving you the concept. But if any one of you is interested in pursuing a tax career, especially in the case of transfer pricing across border, my serious suggestion would be to first understand the domestic law first. Because unless you understand how tax regime generally works, it will be very difficult to appreciate just one angle of it, which is cross border. You might eventually move forward in that direction, that's good. But it's much better to understand how the Indian tax authorities work, how show cause notices are issued, how we need to respond to them, what is the mindset, the practical ground realities, and then venture into one angle if that is something you really want. There are a couple of good firms which do it, and it's important to get that basic understanding. But for any of you tax lovers or tax aficionados or people who are even bored of tax, there's one general advice which has been given to me by my seniors is before you even think of specializing in any law, spend 1 or 2 years in understanding the general laws of this country, your basic CPC, your basic CRPC, your Evidence Act, some of the specialized other legislation that we are doing, including tax. Idea is first 1 or 2 years, you need to have some basic grounding in civil law as well as criminal law, because that is what is going to give you the basis or the foundation to understand this tax law. So I went in a reverse way. deep dived into tax initially, and then I understood that I was only learning one aspect of things. Yes, I or absorb as a sponge as much as I could, but I felt that I'm not learning the other aspects. So that's why I made a shift in my career to also understand why it's important to know different disciplines of law. And then after 2 or 3 years, if you finally narrow down that, oh my God, I love this fat book. This is what I want to take with me to my for the years to come. Then feel free to opt for it. But it has to be an informed choice. An informed choice can only happen once you know and experience different branches and disciplines of law. Otherwise, it's a blind shot, and we all know what happens when we all get into that kind of an exercise. So I think that's all from my end. Don't want to preach the choir here.
So
You
can
guys
I take
already
one
know.
more question?
Yeah, sure.
So somebody was asking about if a transaction is not valid, what action can be taken at that particular moment?
So I'm guessing when we say transaction is not valid, in this context, we are saying the transfer price was not correct. So in that case, if the parties themselves are aware that the price is not correct, then they must redo the calculation, adjust the profit accordingly, and recompute their tax liability. And if by the time they've already filed their returns or obtained a certificate under 92E that we discussed, then those will have to be revised. That is one way of going about it. But if the companies decide to sit quietly about this, not do anything, wait for the authorities to wake up, and if the authorities do wake up, then what happens is they issue a show cause notice under 92C, questioning your transfer price. Now, that show cause notice can get concluded in two ways. Either you are able to satisfy the assessing officer that this was the right price, in which case you win. But if you find that you're not able to convince the tax authorities, then your computation will be revised by that assessing officer, and it will lead to further tax liability. So this is what's going to happen.
Oh, thank you very much, sir.
And that is why there's a huge emphasis on cross-border transactions in MNCs.
Thank you very much, sir. So here we wrap up this session, and I would just like Miss Avantika to present a vote of thanks for such a wonderful session. Avantika, please, can you?
Good evening, everyone. Anika, I hope I am audible.
Yes.
I am. I take immense pleasure in conveying today's vote of thanks on behalf of the amicus curiae and the legal orchid family. It is really a immense pleasure for us that you have spent your valuable time with the budding lawyers and professional. And also, I'm thanking you, sir, for sparing your valuable time to engage with law students important topic of cross-border party transaction. We feel really honored to get an understanding of the topic from your experience and thoughtful. Last but not least, I would like to thank the entire team of the Amicus Curiae and Legal Orchid for pulling off this national webinar in a successful manner in the near future. I want to thank you, sir, once again for your time today. To thank today's participants. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you very much, sir. So participants are now allowed to leave the meeting. One second, sir.
Okay, thank you, Avantika, for that vote of thanks, and thank you, Anika, and everybody else from the Amicus Curiae team for having me here. It was indeed a pleasure to share some of my thoughts on this session. I'm afraid that I could not delve deeper into this, which is something I like a lot because of the constraint of time, but I was I hope I was able to pass on some of my learnings with you all. And I wish you all the best. It was indeed a pleasure being amidst all of you. Have a good evening, everyone. And thank you for the lovely feedback. I think I fished for those at the end.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Bye bye.